My name's Sarah Hyde and I'm the Higher Education Editor at Routledge. I'm joined by Petra Boynton today to talk about her book, Being Well in Academia, which is part of the Insider Guides to Success in Academia series. This series is designed to offer support and practical advice to doctoral students and early career researchers, covering the topics that really matter but which often get overlooked. This indispensable series provides practical and realistic guidance to address many of the needs and challenges of trying to operate and remain in academia. Each book offers insider perspectives on the often implicit rules of the game, the things you need to know but usually aren't told by institutional postgraduate support, researcher development units or supervisors, and will address a practical topic that is key to career progression. The books in this series are essential reading for doctoral students, early career researchers, supervisors, mentors, or anyone looking to launch or maintain their career in academia. The series editors are Pat Thompson and Helen Cara. The book that Petra's written for the series, Being Well in Academia, is the ideal companion for anyone looking to feel stronger, safer, and more connected in what's becoming an increasingly competitive and stressful environment. The book brings a wealth of workable and practical solutions that are not only realistic but diverse in their approach. From increasing your support network to challenging exploitive working environments, this book has suggestions for bringing you happiness, inspiration, motivation, courage, and hope. Petra, thank you for joining me today. Can you tell me why you decided to write Being Well in Academia?
Thank you for having me. Yes, there's two main reasons. My background is a social psychologist working in international health, and my research has always been on, I think, what people would call sensitive topics. So that's sexual and reproductive health. And because I was working in that area, I found quite early in my career, people would ask me to come and do talks about how you manage doing sensitive research, which quite soon led to people saying, I'd like some help about doing field work, or I'd like to know how to navigate what they consider to be dangerous research topics. I kind of wanted to really challenge that early on, because the idea that there's safe topics and dangerous topics is not particularly helpful. All research can be safe or dangerous. And each time I gave a workshop or a talk, someone would come up at the end and say, well, it's all well and good talking about safety in the field, but my problems are in my institution. So that's where I'm facing bullying or harassment or racism, homophobia, sexism, ableism, sometimes all of those things. So I changed the approach to start looking at bullying and abuse, particularly around academic staff and students. And then over the years, and I think particularly in the last 5 years, there's been real concerns about universities and poor management in universities, either causing or worsening physical and mental health problems, particularly around precarity and competition, but also around sort of toxic environments where people just don't feel safe to report issues. They're not taught how to do research or to manage. And so it might be that you're an undergraduate, postgraduate, postdoc, any kind of student. It might be that you are teaching in a university full or part-time. You could be a cleaner, you could be security, you could be a caterer, you might be working in admin. But all those areas, I think, are neglected in terms of talking about safety and well-being. And where it is talked about, I think it tends to be a sort of one-off awareness day, or you might have a therapy session or a yoga session or a visit from, I think one university had alpacas come to visit, which I'd love, but it's not tackling the underlying causes. So that was the main sort of academic side of me working, but I also worked for the last 20 years as an agony aunt. That's an advice columnist, for people who aren't familiar with the term, and it means working in media to signpost people towards sources of support. So what I've done with the book is a kind of combination of those two things, of looking at all the issues people have been facing, trying to find some practical things they can do to help themselves first and foremost, and then to go and find places to, either within universities or outside of them, to get support. And before us talking today, I asked people, given that I'm going to launch the book, what would they like me to talk about? And the overwhelming response was they wanted me to tell you or tell them how to ask for help.
I think asking for help can be hard. So how do you actually go about doing it? And what happens when you just don't know what to do?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is hard. And if it were easy, I wouldn't have to write a book. I wouldn't be doing an advice column, and I think people get frustrated when often they're in crisis and people say, well, haven't you asked for help? and they either feel like there is no help available, or that they have asked and it hasn't been forthcoming. So this is the cringy bit now, where I show the book and say, this is but what I've done here with my helpful, I don't know if you can see my helpful animal markers to help me stay in the right place, is I start off talking about asking for help. And I talk about this thing of help I can't, accept help, because quite often there are really good reasons why you can't. So it's the idea that help might be expensive or complicated or difficult. I don't know if you can see that there. But there might be very genuine reasons why it's difficult for you to either even ask or accept help. Sometimes it's dangerous, sometimes the help isn't there. And sometimes it's that you've just been so ground down by what's going on, you just don't feel you are deserving of help. So one of the things I wanted to try and do within the book was to give people a sense that everybody is worth helping, that all of us can accept help, but sometimes we might really struggle with it. And to put that out there, because too often I think you're in a crisis, or just not in a crisis, but you just want a bit of assistance. You don't know where to go. And you feel like perhaps you're weird or wrong for having that struggle to begin with, where everyone seems to be coping fine, or if they fall into a problem, they fix it quite neatly. Not everyone can fix problems neatly, and I don't claim in the book to have solutions to everything, but it's this idea that you can have a think about, where you might go and get help, and then, once you've done that, to start thinking about ways in which you can ask for it. So here, for example, I talk about the help you need, because quite often people don't know what they're entitled to. And it's quite difficult to ask for help if you don't know what you can have. So chapter 4 is just like a long checklist of all the different things that you might possibly want to ask for help in terms of access, your rights, your safety, your working practices, your study skills, anything you might be doing is sort of outlined there.
So who can people turn to when they really need help?
Well, there's lots of different places you could go. I mean, within institutions themselves, there's a whole range of people. I think I set again out at the beginning of chapter 4, where you have this sense of places you might turn to. And that could be sort of formalised places, like looking at your contract or looking at the syllabus, looking at maybe you've got equality, diversity and inclusion officers or unions, line managers. There's a whole list here that goes on of different places that you could draw on, and it might be that if your own institution doesn't have something, asking people at other institutions where they may go for help. But the real place I get into this is in chapter 2, which is called Creating Your Support Network. And in that chapter, I give people ideas of where they might go for help. And this is like where we do here's one I made earlier. I tried to do this for myself here. I've drawn a very rough diagram, and I'll talk you through it. So when I did my PhD, I was very sick. I had a chronic illness, I had hepatitis, and it led to lots of problems. And at the same time, my relationship broke down, and I was self-funding. So as you can imagine, it was a perfect storm of disaster, really, of anything that could go wrong did. And I felt very alone, actually, during that time. And something that would have helped me, I think, would have been to do what I've done here, which is to sketch out where you could go. So if you look here, that's me at the beginning. And then I put things like friends and family here, and pets, because pets are important to lots of us. But my friends and my family were the main sources of support I had. And I've drawn a line between them because often they would talk to each other. That if my family was worried about me, they'd reach out to friends and vice versa. Now, not everybody has that. So sometimes your family is not a safe place. So your family wouldn't be included on this diagram if that were you. But I have put in the book places you could go if that is the case for you, that your family isn't safe, or that if you feel you don't have a lot of friends. But I've also got my peer group here. Now, they were really good at putting me back in touch with my university. So things like my doctoral studies programme, my supervisor, suggesting I talk to the chaplaincy. I'm not religious, some people are, but the chaplaincy were great at signposting me to sources of financial support because I was in difficulty there, and helping me liaise with the finance office, who I was frequently in trouble with. And then I've got on the other side, my friends were telling me to try and use helplines. I called a charity called Sane9 quite a lot, because I wanted someone to talk to, and my friends, sometimes you just don't want to talk to your friends about issues. And also health topics. So I used a healthcare charity that specialised in liver disease, and a debt line who are really helpful. So you could use those things. And the idea of this is that you draw out in more detail than I've done here, who are the people you could get help? When do you contact them? What are their email contacts? When might you do it? Put it into your diary. Maybe it's a reminder to call home. Maybe it's a reminder to ask a friend to pick up some shopping for you. Perhaps it's about scheduling a visit with your manager, your supervisor. I also put things here like gym, hairdressing and beautician, because that kept me sane. It's been slightly harder over lockdown to access those things, but those were things that I use. Other people can put their own things there. It could be hobbies or sport, music, poetry, reading, anything really that brings you hope and comfort. And then I've got down here psychology, because that's my discipline, the postgraduate SciPag group, the Psychology of Women Inequalities group, were places where if I wasn't getting adequate tuition were giving me that support. And then finally, I've got my union, always important. If you haven't got a union, try and get support from friends and other networks here, but also your union is a huge place of support. And then my GP, who, after a lot of not very good GPs, I finally got a great one who got me in with a counsellor, and then finally with the hospital who were able to help me. So it's just a sort of a rough sketch. My drawing's not great. Some people are much more creative and artistic and can make this look beautiful. You could do this in your own head and think it through. You could talk it through. You could do it digitally if you wanted to. But it's, I mean, some people do this at a spreadsheet, and if that's your thing, that's fine. But what it's the idea of saying is that it's, if I needed somebody right now, that I'm not alone. It could be any of those things at any one time, and having that on your computer saved or on your phone or in your pocket just reminds you aren't alone.
So in the book, you recognise that problems come in a variety of forms, and that help comes in a variety of forms. From whether people might consider them to be quite small problems to things that are much larger. So I think one of the key questions is probably, if somebody was in a crisis, what should they do?
Yeah, I think the main thing is to firstly let somebody know. And that could be that you just ring a helpline. It could be that you call a friend or text somebody. And I've put in here, there's some sort of conversation starters where I say things like, you can say to people stuff like, you know, I might cry, but I want to tell you this, or I'm not quite sure how I'm going to say this, but, or I need your help, or a very specific instruction. I want you to do this for me. Sometimes we feel, especially if we've been marginalised or we're from a marginalised community, that we are not going to get help or not deserving of it. And so being assertive is difficult, but often our friends and our colleagues who want to help us need instruction. We'd like to know what to do. We want to help. So being bold can actually be less scary than it seems and more productive. But yes, I think the idea that you reach out to somebody first, and it might even be that it's not somebody that you would normally think of. I've in crisis certainly turned to somebody who was just like the first person who came to my phone, and I've had messages from people who've like, you know, you haven't taught me for years, but this bad thing has happened, and it's 2 o'clock in the morning here and I don't know who to talk to. So reaching out, thinking of who to use strategically in your support group. I think if you can, either yourself or get someone on your behalf to let your employer, your course, your tutor know. It doesn't have to be in depth at this point. And I talk in the book about the fact that there are certain things you might not want to necessarily reveal right away, but that let somebody know that you are struggling, because I think they can start to make allowances then, and you can come back to them with more sort of points around the specifics you need and the evolving issue as it happens. But also there's a thing at the beginning of the book, and I wasn't sure where to put this, and it's a safety plan. And I initially wondered whether I should put it at the end, and then I thought, actually, we can't pretend that people in universities and in academic spaces aren't in crisis. So some people really do struggle with their mental health and at times feel like life is just too hard. And so what a safety plan involves is that it gets you to go through who you would need for help, what normally distracts you, what's helped you in the past if you felt like this before. You may not have done, but if you have, what would you do? Where do you go for help? It might be you've got people to turn to. It might be you've got community health teams or psychiatric nurse or somebody to talk to. It might not be. They might not be available in your country, or it might not be something you can afford. So if you haven't got affordable things, where else would you go? And the idea of this is that you might do this at a time where you feel completely calm. In fact, it's probably better to do it at a time when you might feel that you could be at risk in the future. And it doesn't have to be a huge crisis, but it's good to know if something bad were to happen, what would I do, so that you kind of reach for this in the crisis. You haven't got to sit there and think of all the answers while your head's all over the place, and you might not even be able to concentrate. And it's designed to just signpost you to where you would go for help. That could include healthcare, it could include an emergency setting, it could include getting someone to come around and sit with you until that moment passes. It also includes, as everywhere, all the chapters end with sources of support. So it tells you where you could go and how to access care. I've tried to include global resources as much as possible, because obviously, you know, the trouble with a lot of advice for academics is it tends to be for people who are based in the States, who are all funded, white, able-bodied, straight STEM students, and that's fine because those people need help, but we're a big community. So I wanted to try and have a big range of topics and places you could go. And if your particular need isn't covered, that you could at least try an adjacent area that might bring you closer to what you have. Sometimes there are localized support networks, but they're hard to find. You need sort of a bigger charity to signpost you to them, or somebody to help you find them.
So in the current pandemic climate, people can feel quite cut off. So how about helping yourself? Is that something that's possible?
Yeah, and I think that this was something I wrestled with, because the whole issue with self-help is that it's become quite commercialized and medicalized as well, so that any problem automatically has to have a therapeutic or medical solution, which isn't always appropriate or available, or that you kind of sort your issues out through bubble baths and shopping sprees and things like that, which are all perfectly lovely if that's what you like, but are not always necessarily appropriate or useful. And again, I think people get frustrated when they're struggling that you come up with things that they could have thought of for themselves. So I'll admit, I have put in the book things that you probably have thought for yourself, because sometimes it's good to be reminded. But I've also tried to give a wider range of solutions and options that people might want to think about. So one of the things I've done is a kind of an A to Z of issues. It's like almost like an old style phone book of threats to your well-being, and it just talks you through. It could be things like access issues, it could be things like just looking at random dealing with how you navigate conferences on or offline, or it could be stuff around disability, it might be around imposter syndrome. There's all sorts of things covered here, from sort of poverty and violence through to sort of less serious issues that still could be causing you problems, like how to deal with an overwhelming email inbox. And so that gives you sort of ideas that you could help yourself, or where to get others to help you. I also talk in chapter 6 about some of the things that are warning signs that you might want to spot and that you might have noticed. They may not be troubling you. So I do make the point that you might have lots of symptoms that, again, with the pandemic are quite understandable. It's a normal reaction to have problems with sleeping and concentration and connectivity, because it's hard. And I think we need to remind ourselves constantly while this is going on. I mean, I didn't write a book for a pandemic, but I'm glad I did, because now we're in this situation. I think we need constant reminders that it's not business as usual. We are struggling. We are allowed to ask for help. We should slow down. It's not the time to be more competitive and push ourselves. And some of our reactions to it may not be the healthiest ones. We may not be doing what's right for ourselves, and we could very well know that. We might know that self-harming and overeating or not eating or struggling with drugs and alcohol is not the best way to approach things, but we also may not know how to deal with that. So I've been quite frank in talking around some of the more taboo ways we may go about trying to look after ourselves, with, again, ideas for how you could help yourself, and if you're not sure, who would be the next person to talk to. And it might be that you talk about that within your institution or your friends, but equally, some of these things you may not want to. So there are lots of places you could go in confidence to talk over those issues, to help you get to a point you may want to either sort it yourself or go somewhere else in the workplace. And then towards the end, I've got a chapter where this was my, or second to last chapter, it's my favourite one to write, which is this looking after yourself. And that's where I took people's suggestions, and it can be things like crafting, it can be things like relaxation, it can be things like poetry or dance or music or exercise. And I try to sort of think about it depending on everybody's ability. So it can cater towards you if you are chronically sick or you're disabled, or if you're on a budget, or if you are in a very remote area, or where you're working currently online and isolated and there isn't really anybody around, or perhaps you are all stuck in a household and struggling for just 5 minutes apiece. So I've tried to, offer a range of things, and you'll see in the book fairly early on, whether it's helping, asking for help or anything, it's this sense that you could take it, break it and remake it, that you will look at it and say, well, this idea is great in theory, but it doesn't work for me. So having the permission to try again and do something different, or to actually reject it outright and say, you know what, that's ridiculous. Why is she even suggesting that? That's okay. I don't mind if people don't like all the ideas. I hope there's enough in there that something's going to be helpful. But if it's not, with your support network, you can work out alternatives for yourself, so that there's a comfort and care within a kind of practical assistance within the text.
Thank you, Petra. It was really good to speak with you today.
Thank you.